Our sermon passage this morning is Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. The visit of the Magi. Anyone who is comfortable doing so, please stand for the reading. And if I don't tell you to sit back down, feel free to sit back down after verse 12. Okay? Short-term memory loss is a real thing for me. So, all right, Matthew 2, verses 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time that the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, report it to me so that I too may go and worship him." And after they heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them, until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. Excuse me. So today is my second message from the series Remnants of Faith. And of course, today we are focusing on the visit of the Magi. And you might ask, are the Magi considered remnants of faith too? And I would argue yes, and I hope that you'll also be convinced by the time we're done. Last week we talked about Luke 2, 21 through 40, about Jesus being presented at the temple and the promise that was kept to Simeon. Next week I'll be preaching on Matthew 2, 13 through 23, about the escape to Egypt. And then the fourth week and the last message of the series will be Luke 2, 41 through 52. And we'll be speaking about Jesus' childhood visit to Jerusalem. So my subtitle for the sermon today, as you can see, is The Stunned, Complacent, and the Seeking. And in this passage, we see each of those responses are demonstrated when different groups of people are confronted with and made aware by the arrival and the presence of the Messiah. Excuse me. I believe it's good for each of us to take inventory and ask ourselves, if Christ were to return today, where will we stand on this? How will we respond? Are we seeking and pursuing the Lord? Are we prepared for his arrival like the wise and faithful servant that we read about in Matthew 24 and Luke 12? But in this passage in Matthew 2, Matthew introduces a couple of new people into his narrative. Of course, we have Jesus, but we also have the Magi, we have King Herod, and we have the chief priests and the teachers of law. But going back to Jesus, of course, we should begin with him. When we look at Jesus' earthly life, just before and after his infancy, it's really only spoken about in Luke and Matthew's Gospels in the first couple chapters. We don't know a lot of other things about Jesus' life before his baptism and the beginning of his ministry, later in his life when he was probably about 30 years old. But each gospel, the writer has different, ultimately they're sharing about the life of Christ, but each has a different motive behind their gospel as well. So we know that Matthew's gospel is geared more towards a Jewish audience and descendants from the 12 tribes of Israel, and he is proclaiming Jesus of Nazareth is and was the long-awaited Davidic Messiah and King. That is Matthew's main thrust for his message, and he is constantly pointing out different messianic prophecies that have been fulfilled by Christ. In Luke's gospel, you could say it's more geared towards a Greek audience, and part of knowing that is right off the beginning because he addresses his letter to most excellent Theophilus. But his motive is proclaiming Jesus as Lord, showing how he was rejected by his own people, the Jews, but he was also a beacon of hope and salvation for both Jews and Gentiles. So that is a big part of Luke's message and approach. And I was putting together the timeline for these couple of chapters in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew. And as I started producing this timeline, it got to be pretty long, and it's amazing how much information is divulged in just those first couple chapters of those two Gospels. And I got down to 20 on my bullet list, and I could have probably broken it up even more if I wanted to. But lastly, we've talked about the birth of Christ, and it's probably a little taboo and weird to be talking about the birth of Christ here in January 15th, because you're not supposed to talk about it that much after Christmas, right? But we're still kind of talking about it, and I think it's important to reflect on these times and stories that led up to Christ's ministry when he was an adult, when he was around 30. So last week we talked about, in Luke 2, Jesus was presented at the temple. He was circumcised on the 8th day, and then Mary and Joseph and Jesus went for the purification, to make an offering, the purification rites on her behalf, and also there was the dedication of Christ. And we don't hear about any money being exchanged, and we know that if you do not redeem the firstborn, he belongs to the Lord, and we know that Jesus belonged to the Lord. I think that's a safe thing to assume. And then they are confronted by Simeon and Anna the prophetess. And of course, they receive some words of encouragement, but also some tough words that come from Simeon. But ultimately, it had to be a pretty encouraging and amazing experience for Mary and Joseph, and also, of course, for Simeon and Anna, as God had kept his promise with Simeon. Simeon it had been revealed to him that he wouldn't die until he had seen the Messiah. And even if the Messiah was only 40 days old at that point, he still got to see him before he passed. So God kept his promise to him. And we know that after verse 39, we are told that the boy grew strong and they returned back to Nazareth. But something happened between then that Matthew talks about. And if we go chronologically, then this next event comes in Matthew chapter 2. And this is the visit of the Magi, this period of time that occurs in the escape to Egypt before Mary and Joseph and Jesus return back to Nazareth and they go back home. So Matthew 2, in the first couple of verses here, we read, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, 'Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him.'" Now the Magi deserve some attention as well, because when I think about the Magi, it's easy to blast through Matthew chapter 2 and just move on to the good stuff, like I always say, into the meat of the Gospels where Jesus begins his ministry. But I always ask, who are these Magi? And were they genuine in their visit, or were they just trying to stir things up and draw some attention? And we'll answer that question a little later. But who were these guys? Who were the Magi? Tradition tells us that there were 3 Magi, right? Because of the 3 gifts, mostly. I believe that's maybe the logical conclusion that some people come to. We're told that they were there when Jesus was born, and you pretty much won't find any nativity set that doesn't include the 3 Magi's, right? So that's the second thing. And I even learned that some people have assigned a name for each of the Magi: Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. Did you guys know that? Raise your hand if you knew they had names too. Yeah? Okay. Well, learn something new every day, I guess. So I was pretty surprised by that, because I don't recall seeing that anywhere in this passage here in Matthew 2. I don't recall Matthew saying there was 3, that they were there when Jesus was born, or what their names were. But that is what tradition tells us. But Scripture tells us something different, that these are just some common misconceptions if we don't look a little bit closer. You might be tempted when you think about the Magi just to write them off when you hear about them, because we often associate them as sorcerers, pagan sorcerers and magicians and diviners who just kind of randomly come onto the scene for a few verses and then they head back where they came from. But based on our passage today, I believe that would be a pretty narrow perspective, and I believe there's a lot more to these particular Magi than we may give them credit for. Now, of course, the word magic or magician originates from the word Magi, and as I understand it, the Magi were actually more of a tribe, a people within their land, within Persia, more so than being a Magi was an occupation or a practice. Excuse me. They may have even been considered as counterparts of the priests and the Levites from the 12 tribes of Israel, except among their own people. These were the wise men of their culture. While it would appear that some of them probably were sorcerers and magicians and diviners, it does not necessarily hold that all of them were. We shouldn't paint them all with that same brush. We may recall them most from the book of Daniel. They were in the king's court. They were advisors to the king, and of course, as the story goes, Nebuchadnezzar has these troubling and disturbing dreams, and he wants them to be interpreted, and or else. He wants them interpreted or else. There's a price to pay if you can't get the job done. So the Magi were unable to do it, but by God's blessing, Daniel, the prophet Daniel, was actually able to interpret the king's dreams for him, and because he was able to do that, he was given a high position of authority even over the Magi at that time. So, but nonetheless, these Magi were powerful men, and they have different nicknames. They call them the wise men, the three kings, or the Magi. But they were powerful. They were influential men of their culture and amongst their people. Even though they may not have been kings. Some of them may have been kings, but they certainly were at the top of the food chain within their culture. They were men of influence. They were educated in their own laws and rituals and traditions. They were educated in their history and mathematics and astrology and astronomy, and perhaps even the Holy Scriptures and the prophecies, because they had been in the company of the prophet Daniel for several years at one point. So, excuse me. Whether it was by divine revelation or prophecies revealed to them, like in Numbers 24 or Daniel 9, where Daniel talks about the 77s, 490 years, the Magi recognized the star that we know as the Star of Bethlehem. They recognized it when it appeared in the sky, and when they saw the star, they knew what time it was, and they made their way to Jerusalem. They recognized something special and different in the sky that night, and these were men who looked at the sky often. They understood the different constellations and the things like that. So when you think about this journey that they made all the way to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, this was no short and casual journey. This was quite a task here, and this journey would have gone somewhere between maybe 800 and 900 miles. And for most of us who travel by car, this might not seem like that big a deal, but try walking 800 to 900 miles through rough terrain and rocky terrain. I can't tell you how it goes. I certainly haven't done it, but I'm sure that is quite a task. And if you were averaging 5 miles a day, you could have got there in 6 months. So we don't know what kind of pace these guys were working at, but we do know that is a pretty good hike. And you got to really be intentional about where you're going to make that kind of journey, I would think. So that's a little background about the Magi, and I just want to paint the picture a little bit before we get into our passage today, a little bit more, so we can understand who these people were and add some context to this story and this narrative. Now, the other person that's mentioned here is Herod the Great, also known as Herod the First, also known as King Herod. Herod has been known and respected as a great builder and an architect, and he's known for mostly probably for his expansion and renovation on the temple. And the temple was one of the great marvels of that time in architecture. People were amazed by it, and the disciples were so amazed they thought that they couldn't believe that such a building could ever perish. He's also known for a less favorable act in our scriptures, which is known as the murder or the massacre of the innocents, and that's what we're going to talk about next week, and I know you guys can hardly wait for that. So, but there was far more to Herod's story and others who preceded him during this intertestamental period that is also known as the quiet years, which is the 400 or so years between the words of and the prophecies of the prophet Malachi and the arrival of Christ. There were 400 years there where during this time there was really no prophetic voice, and there was this perception by some people that God was not really involved and active in the lives of the Jews during that time. We know from Daniel 9 that during this time he had talked about 7 sevens, 62 sevens, and then one final week, which would be 7 years, which would amount to 490 years. There's some debate on the last week, whether it's already occurred, whether it's coming. We're not here to debate about that today. But we know that during this time, they were at least they were in the midst or towards the end of these 62 sevens, where they were making atonement for their sin and the rebellion, their idolatry against God. And they had been exiled, and they returned, and they've been scattered. And a lot had happened to the Israelites during this time, and the Jews. So it was during the 1st century BC, that is when Herod was appointed as the king of the Jews. And he was appointed by his friend Mark Antony. He was one of the rulers of Rome, one of the 3 at the time, in 37 BC. And Mark Antony, eventually, it was just him and a fellow ruler named Octavian. They were rivals at this point. It's a pretty fascinating story that I'm not going to go into great detail about, but Octavian won that battle, and Octavian became who we know today as Caesar Augustus, and he was the only ruler, he was the emperor, and he turned Rome from a republic into an empire at this time. So Octavian was the man at this point. And Herod's thinking, oh no, now what am I going to do? I was on the wrong side of this battle. So he went and groveled to Octavian, and somehow or another he was able to remain as the king of the Jews in the region of Israel. So pretty interesting stories when you think about a lot of the background of things that happened, especially in the life of King Herod. But all in all, he was the ruler in this region from 37 to 4 BC. And because he died in 4 BC, per the historical writings of Josephus, the famous Jewish historian, many believe that Christ was actually born in 6 to 4 BC rather than, there is no year 0. It's either 1 BC or 1 AD. And this is just some pretty interesting food for thought to think about. And there's a lot of debate on both sides. But nonetheless, at least initially, Herod, when he came into power, he sought the approval and the favor of the Jews as a ruler. Everybody wants to be liked, right? And he wanted to be liked too. But he himself was not an ancestral Jew. He was an Idumean, which is the region of modern-day Jordan. And the Jews would only accept a king from the Davidic line. They could only be ruled by a king from the Davidic line. So he never really gained the respect or the favor of the people that he desired. And I believe at some point he didn't care anymore. And of course, there are some people amongst the Jews who did perhaps seek his favor and would compromise their belief in God for the sake of political power or personal gain. So of course that was probably happening. But throughout his rule, excuse me, I need a drink of water. Throughout Herod's rule, due to paranoia and fear that others were seeking to take his throne, he was a pretty merciless person. He did what he had to do to stay in power. He had one of his wives executed. He had 3 of his sons executed or murdered, a nephew, and probably several other people that remain nameless to this day that he took out, who he considered to be a threat to his throne. So this is the kind of guy we're dealing with here in this passage. At this time, Herod was also probably near death. He suffered tremendously towards the end of his life. Thank you, Lord, I guess, for justice. But he was just a ruthless, paranoid, and he was suffering from intense pain and ailments. But up to this point in his life, his actions would certainly imply that he was just a really selfish and power-hungry and wicked man. He would stop at nothing to keep his power and exalt himself. So you see up there's some other people listed, his successors who somehow managed to survive his reign. And no thanks to Herod, 3 of his sons assumed power after his death. And you hear about them throughout the New Testament. And Archelaus, he only ruled until 6 AD. He was the ethnarch. And I was like, what is that ethnarch? Well, that is basically the successor, the head ruler of the Jews. And in 6 AD, he was replaced, and the Romans took over that territory, where eventually Pontius Pilate became the procurator or the governor of that region. You have Antipas, you might recall. He was the one who took Philip II's wife, Herodias, and the daughter is Salome the first. And you might remember the dance, and John the Baptist somehow ends up being beheaded with his head on a platter for her. So then you have Philip II. Philip and Antipas and Salome were tetrarchs, meaning they ruled a quarter of the region at that time. So it's a messy story. It really is. And I looked at the family tree of Herod, and it was really confusing, and I was able to piece a few things together. I don't know if you want to subject yourself to that, but let me just assure you it was a messy thing. There's a lot going on there. So we've talked about the Magi and Herod, and I know I've gone on for a while here, and thank you for your patience. I'm going to go back and read the first two verses, just in case you forgot what we were talking about. Verse 1, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. In verse 3, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. This was an uh-oh moment for Herod. Why was Herod and all of Jerusalem so disturbed by this? Shouldn't this have been good news for them? Well, the Magi and the nations from the east, for one, were not under Roman rule, nor were they under the rule of Herod, of course. And the fact that the Magi made it all this way, 800 to 900 miles, right to Herod's doorstep, unscathed, is another pretty amazing thing. And I'm sure Herod was quite surprised when he saw them, and probably didn't know what they wanted until they actually made their intentions known. But if there were just three men, could these three men who troubled Herod so much, could it just have been three? I believe there was probably a whole caravan of soldiers and security coming along with them, especially considering they were carrying precious cargo and treasures that they were going to present to the Messiah. So, when you hear there's three wise men, I don't think that's realistic. Of course, I can't prove that, but it just doesn't seem to me, the logic just isn't there. But nonetheless, when they show up, they obviously came in peace, and Herod allowed them to come in and speak to him. And when they made their question and their intentions known about the Messiah, Herod was disturbed. And another reason for this was that the Magi, they didn't come to pay homage to Herod. He was the king of the region. They came to pay homage to the true king, the eternal king, the Messiah, Jesus Christ. And this was a troubling thing for Herod. He once again could feel the tension and the anxiety and the paranoia and the fear building up within himself when this happened, just as it had before. What were these guys doing? Were they trying to secure a relationship for the sake of planning a future revolt against Rome, against Herod? Did they want to overthrow him? And Herod had to be wondering, how did nobody know about this? How did this thing happen right under our noses? Why didn't the religious leaders know about the arrival of the Messiah if indeed he's there where the Magi are seeking him? I imagine he had some choice words for these people at the time, and he was probably not very happy about it. But nobody in high places seemed to know about this thing that had happened in the Messiah being born. So in verse 4 we read, when he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And this is Micah 5:2, which we have read throughout the Christmas season as well. Other passages that the Magi may have been aware of during this time, or before, was Numbers 24:17, and this was the prophet Balaam, who King Balak had tried to have him curse the Israelites, and all he could do was bless them. And I believe in his third prophecy, he speaks of the coming king. He says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab, the skulls of all the people of Sheth. And then Isaiah 63 reads, nations will come to your light, and the kings to the brightness of your dawn. And perhaps these are some of the passages that the Magi kept in mind when they saw that star. So Herod is wondering, is this true? Is this real? Is this really happening now? Has the Messiah really been born right under my nose? So he calls in the big dogs. He calls in members of the Sanhedrin, the chief priests and the experts of law. The Sanhedrin consisted of 70 to 72 men. This is the Jewish ruling council of that time. These were, of course, they weren't above Herod, but they were somewhere underneath there amongst the people. But the Sanhedrin consisted of different people. It consisted of the high priest and the elders, which would have consisted of past high priests and probably influential and powerful people from the other 11 tribes. You have the scribes and the teachers of law. The scribes are the ones who would transcribe the scriptures. And of course, if you do that enough times, you're going to probably memorize the scriptures and know them pretty well. You have the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And, it could be a little overwhelming when you hear all these. And you're like, what are these guys? What is the difference between one and the other? Well, there is some overlap. But just for example, the Pharisees are different from the Sadducees in the sense that the Sadducees would only accept the first 5 books of the Bible as being authoritative, the Pentateuch, the Torah, and then you had the Sadducees, which they accepted what we know as the 39 books of the Old Testament, or what they would have known as the Septuagint. So that's one difference. Another difference is that the Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife. They weren't into spiritual things like angels and demons, and the Pharisees were. The Pharisees were more of the common man. The Sadducees were more of the diplomatic type that didn't hold as firmly to the law as the Pharisees did. And of course, we know later on Jesus rebuked the Pharisees time and time again because they were so worried about the letter of the law, but they didn't follow it by faith and with the right heart. So I digress. But these guys have come into the mix. And Herod is asking them, "Has this really happened? Has this really happened under my nose?" And more so, how did you not know about it? You're the experts here. Why did you not know about it? Shouldn't they have been just as eager as the Magi to go and see where this child was? And as far as we know, they didn't. As far as we know, they were just complacent. Maybe they were petrified with fear or paralyzed with fear, and they didn't make the trip, as far as we know, the Magi. What a shame that is. Verse 7 says, "Then Herod called the Magi secretly, and he found out from them the exact time that the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, 'Go and search carefully for the child, and as soon as you find him, report him to me, so that I too may go and worship him.'" Oh, what a guy. If you didn't read ahead, you might have thought, like, okay, yeah, he really wants to. But so Herod tries to secretly devise this wicked scheme by calling the Magi in and trying to gain more intel on where the child is and if indeed the Messiah was born in this place where the Magi were seeking. So we're going to talk more about Herod's wicked plans next Sunday. But fortunately, for the time being, he goes ahead and he sends the Magi on their way peacefully, and he allows them to do as they wish. But he also asks them to do a little bit of dirty work for him so that he may also go and worship them. And he really shows what a snake in the grass he is at this point. At verse 9, we read, "After they heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen, when it rose, it went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were overjoyed." And I believe this verse right here and the following too answers the question as to whether the Magi were genuine or not. Were they genuine, or were they just trying to make a scene here? And though these men were Gentiles, clearly the Lord was for them, the Lord was with them in their journey and actually finding the Messiah and coming to the exact place where he was, where the star stopped right over that place. And that would, of course, be, if you're reading Luke right off the bat, that has to be pretty encouraging news as a Gentile to read about these men from the east traveling all this way and God's favor being upon them. And then there's the star. We have to talk about the star. Did nobody else notice this star, this king star that the Magi had seen? Was it a comet? Was it a cluster of stars? Was it a cluster of planets? Was it a supernova? What was it? Was it a natural phenomenon or a divine miracle? There's debate on both sides of that argument, but whatever the case, we know that the Lord used it to alert and to guide the Magi to this place and into the presence of the Messiah. It's always tempting for people in this age of empiricism to try and reason and explain away supernatural workings of God, as well as some of the incredible events and the happenings from the Scriptures in the Old and the New Testament. But if you believe that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended to heaven at the right hand of God, then don't try to be too cool. You're already out of the club. So I'm not saying you throw caution to the wind. Like, we obviously want to be reasonable about it as far as Scripture is concerned. But your naturalist friends and your secular friends, they're not going to buy that either. So don't think you're going to get by with just a little bit. Anyway, verse 11. "On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and they worshipped him. And thankfully, at this point, Mary and Joseph are in a house. They're no longer in a cave or a stable. Jesus is no longer laying in a manger. They're in a house, living a fairly normal life, I imagine. But at this point, it had probably been 1 to 2 years since they had first seen the star, since Jesus was born. And of course, we're going to read more about that next week as well. But just take my word for it for now, if you haven't read that before. But the Magi, when they arrived, they immediately bow down and they worship this child. What an amazing sight that must have been for Mary and Joseph to have these kings and probably this entourage of people come and bow down before this little child. After such a long journey and so many months, maybe even more than a year of travel, the Magi had finally reached their destination with the Lord's blessing. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So the Magi present their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And each gift has a different meaning or a different symbolic meaning. Gold would seem to symbolize Christ's divinity, his kingship, for he is God in the flesh, King of kings, the Lord of lords, the Prince of peace, Emmanuel, God with us, and all the other titles. And the Magi certainly acknowledged that before they even left for this trip. They presented frankincense, which is a symbol of holiness and righteousness. It's used for offerings, and we know that Christ offered himself to the Father on behalf of man. It could represent Christ's future place as the eternal high priest. Of course, he is now, but back at that point. And then there was myrrh, which is a spice that is used for embalming or a bitter, numbing drink. You might recall when Jesus was on the cross, he was presented with gall to try and numb some of the pain. But it's used to dilute pain, but it symbolizes a bitterness and suffering and affliction. We know that Christ endured all of that as well. And even though Herod responded to this good news, it should have been good news, by devising a wicked scheme, and that the Jewish religious leaders sought Christ not, the Magi, they worshipped him. And we know that Christ will be worshipped. Christ will be exalted no matter what. It doesn't matter, even if his own people rejected him. And of course, after that, they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, thankfully, and they went about their way. You might recall in John 1, verses 9 through 14, we read, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world, and he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Praise the Lord for that. You might recall Christ in his triumphal entry. When he came to the place, this is Luke 9, verse 37, when he came to the place, came near the place where the road goes down to the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began joyfully praising God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. They said, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." Jesus said, "I tell you, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. Christ will be glorified." And he wept over Jerusalem after that. In Luke 12:49, Jesus talks about, he rebukes the people and the Pharisees for not being able to interpret the times, for not having that sense of urgency and understanding when it counted. In Luke 12:54, he said to the crowd, "When you see a cloud rising in the west, immediately you say, 'It's going to rain,' and it does. And when a south wind blows, you say, 'It's going to be hot,' and it is. Hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and the sky. How is it that you don't know how to interpret the present time?" Verse 57, he says, Why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? As you are going with your adversary to the magistrate, try hard to be reconciled on the way, or your adversary may drag you off to the judge, and the judge turn you over to the officer, and the officer throw you into prison. I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. What is he talking about there? He's saying now is your chance to make peace with God. Now is your time to be reconciled with God. Right now. What are you waiting for? Why can you not recognize the Messiah standing right in front of you. And of course, for us, we know the Messiah has already come. So the Magi and Herod and the Jewish religious leaders were presented with these choices in response to Christ's arrival. And we are presented with these same choices when it comes to his future arrival. What are we going to be looking like? Are we going to be stunned? Are we going to be complacent? Are we going to be seeking the Lord? Are we going to have that sense of urgency? We must interpret the times right now. In the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, and the other Gospels, Matthew 24, on verse 9, Jesus has already talked about some of the things that are going to happen. He says, these are just the beginnings of the birth pains. It's going to get a lot worse. And in verse 9, he says, then you will be handed over and be persecuted and put to death. You will be hated by all nations because of me. And at that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. And I think we all know we are certainly closer to the end today than we were back then, and every day forward, we are getting closer and closer to the return of Christ. So in light of Christ's great love and his sacrifice on the cross and his gift of eternal life, my hope and prayer for you today is that you will be encouraged and inspired to respond as one who seeks and pursues the Messiah, one who stands firm to the end, and one who will be saved. That you will be a wise and faithful servant who is carrying out the Master's will when he returns like a thief in the night, and one whom he will praise by saying, well done, my good and faithful servant.